The eviction notice trembled in her weathered hands as the sheriff's deputy waited by the door, his expression carefully neutral while watching a 74-year-old woman's world collapse in real time. Behind her, the sound of her husband's wheelchair scraping against the wooden floor of their farmhouse echoed like a countdown to homelessness, each movement a painful reminder that after 52 years of marriage and backbreaking labor, they were about to lose everything. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Margaret Hartwell stood in the doorway of the farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of her family, watching as the bank's representatives cataloged items for the foreclosure auction. Each piece of furniture represented a memory: the kitchen table where she'd taught her 3 children to read, the rocking chair where she'd nursed them through fevers and nightmares, the china cabinet containing her grandmother's wedding dishes that had survived the Great Depression only to be lost to a modern financial crisis. "Ma'am, we need you to vacate by noon," the deputy said, not unkindly. Deputy Carson had gone to school with her eldest son, David, before the cancer took him at 41. "I'm sorry about this, Mrs. Hartwell. I truly am." Behind her, Walter's wheelchair caught on the threshold again. At 76, the stroke had taken his mobility, but not his pride, and she could hear him struggling to navigate the doorway without asking for help. Their border collie, Scout, whined anxiously, sensing the distress that permeated every corner of their soon-to-be former home. "Just a few more minutes," Margaret pleaded, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "Please." The deputy nodded, stepping back to give them space for their final goodbye to 5 decades of memories. Walter finally maneuvered his chair beside her, his good hand reaching for hers. His left side remained partially paralyzed from the stroke 2 years ago, the medical catastrophe that had started their financial spiral. What insurance didn't cover had consumed their savings. The second mortgage they'd taken for his rehabilitation had seemed manageable until the pandemic destroyed their small roadside produce business. "Where will we go, Maggie?" Walter's voice, once strong enough to call cattle across 40 acres, now emerged as barely more than a whisper. Margaret squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses earned through decades of farm work. "Your brother's hunting cabin," she said, trying to inject optimism she didn't feel into her voice. "Robert said we could stay there as long as we need." Neither mentioned that Robert's hunting cabin was a generous description for what was essentially a broken-down barn with pretensions of shelter 60 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable in bad weather. It had been abandoned for 15 years since Robert's death, and their nephew Timothy, who'd inherited it, lived in Seattle and had made clear he wanted nothing to do with that worthless piece of dirt. Their daughter Jennifer had offered her basement in Chicago, but Margaret had seen the strain in her daughter's eyes, heard the tension in her son-in-law Michael's voice. They were already supporting Michael's elderly parents and struggling with their own finances. Their younger daughter, Patricia, lived in a studio apartment in New York. Phone calls had grown infrequent as their children grappled with their own survival in an unforgiving economy. As Margaret loaded their few permitted possessions into their 1994 Ford pickup, the bank had deemed it too old to be worth seizing. She mentally cataloged what they were leaving behind. The farm equipment would be auctioned. The livestock had been sold months ago to pay for Walter's medications. The land itself, 120 acres of prime farmland their family had worked since 1892, would likely be developed into another suburban subdivision. Scout jumped into the truck bed, circling nervously among the boxes and bags that contained the remnants of their life. The dog was 12, ancient for a working breed, but still fiercely protective of his humans. Margaret had found him as a puppy, abandoned in a ditch during a thunderstorm, and he'd repaid that kindness with unwavering loyalty. "Ready?" she asked Walter, though neither of them would ever be ready for this moment. He nodded, jaw set with the same determination that had carried him through 2 tours in Vietnam, through droughts and floods, through raising 3 children and burying 1. "Let's go." The drive took 3 hours on increasingly deteriorated roads. Walter dozed fitfully, his medication making him drowsy, while Margaret navigated by memory and fading road signs. The landscape transformed from fertile farmland to dense forest, from maintained highways to potholed country roads, from civilization to isolation. When they finally turned onto the overgrown track leading to the cabin, Margaret's heart sank further. The photos Timothy had sent were clearly decades old. What greeted them was barely recognizable as a structure. The barn fort had never really been a hunting cabin, stood like a wounded giant against the darkening sky. Half the roof had collapsed, leaving gaping holes that invited rain and wildlife. The walls leaned at precarious angles, held up more by stubbornness than structural integrity. Windows were either broken or boarded over with weathered plywood. "Oh, Walter," Margaret breathed, the full weight of their situation crashing over her. Walter's good hand found hers again. "We've weathered worse storms," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Scout jumped from the truck and immediately began investigating, his nose to the ground as he circled the derelict structure. He barked once, sharp and alert, at something near the barn's foundation. "What is it, boy?" Margaret asked, but Scout had already disappeared around the corner of the building. The interior was worse than the exterior suggested. Daylight filtered through dozens of holes in the remaining roof. The floor was littered with debris, old timber, rusted tools, and evidence of various animals that had made the barn their home. A rickety ladder led to what might have been a loft, though half of it had collapsed into the main space below. "We can't stay here," Margaret said, fighting despair. "Walter, we don't have a choice," he interrupted gently. "But we'll make it work. We always have." They spent the remaining daylight hours clearing a small section of the barn, creating a relatively clean space large enough for Walter's wheelchair to maneuver. Margaret strung a tarp over the worst of the holes above their makeshift living area, though she knew it would provide minimal protection against serious weather. As darkness fell, they huddled together on an old mattress they'd brought from home, sharing a can of soup heated on a portable camping stove. Scout curled against Walter's wheelchair, occasionally raising his head to stare intently at the barn's eastern wall. "He's been doing that all evening," Walter observed. "Something's got his attention." "Probably mice," Margaret said, though Scout's behavior seemed too focused for small prey. "We'll need to set traps tomorrow." That night, as rain began pattering against their inadequate tarp, Margaret lay awake calculating their resources. They had $847 in checking, ironically, almost the same amount they'd started their marriage with 52 years ago. Social Security would bring $1,646 next month, but Walter's medications alone cost $580, even with Medicare. Food, gas, and basic necessities would consume the rest. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to Scout's urgent barking and the sound of Walter calling her name. Pale morning light filtered through the barn's gaps, and Scout was pawing frantically at a section of the eastern wall. "He's been at it for an hour," Walter said. "Won't leave it alone." Margaret approached the wall, constructed of thick wooden planks that had aged to silver gray. Scout's pawing had disturbed years of accumulated dirt and debris at the base, revealing what looked like the edge of a metal plate. "Help me clear this," she told Walter, who wheeled closer and used a broken rake handle to scrape away more debris. 20 minutes of work revealed a rusted metal door, perhaps 3 feet square, set into the floor against the wall. Heavy iron hinges suggested age, while a padlock, orange with rust, secured it shut. "A root cellar?" Walter suggested. "In a barn?" Margaret was skeptical. "And why lock a root cellar?" Scout whined and pawed at the lock, his behavior increasingly agitated. Margaret found a hammer among the scattered tools, and, after several blows, the ancient lock crumbled. The door was heavy, requiring all Margaret's remaining strength to lift. Beneath lay darkness and a ladder descending into the earth. Cool air rose from the opening, carrying scents of earth and age, and something else, something metallic. Scout barked once and started down the ladder before Margaret could stop him. "Scout, get back here!" But the dog had vanished into the darkness. His barks echoed from below, taking on an odd quality in the confined space. "I'm going after him," Margaret decided. "Maggie, no. You don't know what's down there. Could be unstable, could be—" "I'm not losing Scout too," she said firmly, testing the ladder's first rung. It held. The descent took her 15 feet into the earth, far deeper than any root cellar. Her feet found solid ground, not dirt, but what felt like stone. As her eyes adjusted, she gasped. She stood in a tunnel carved from bedrock, walls smooth as if polished, extending beyond the reach of the daylight filtering from above. Scout sat a few feet away, tail wagging, clearly pleased with his discovery. "Walter," she called up, "you need to see this." "I can't exactly climb down a ladder," he reminded her with dry humor. "There's a tunnel, an actual tunnel. It goes." She peered into the darkness. "I can't see how far." Back in the barn, they discussed their discovery. Walter, ever practical, worried about safety and legality. Margaret, energized by mystery, wanted to explore immediately. "We need light," Walter said, "and rope. You're not going into some tunnel without proper equipment." They had a flashlight in their emergency kit, and Margaret found a coil of old rope in the barn's debris. Against Walter's protests, she prepared to explore. "Just a quick look," she promised. "I'll stay within shouting distance." The tunnel proved even more intriguing than its mere existence suggested. The walls weren't rough-hewn, but carved with precision, following what seemed to be a natural fissure in the bedrock. The floor was level, cleared of obstacles. Most surprisingly, small alcoves appeared at regular intervals, each containing remnants of what might have been torch holders. Scout led the way confidently, as if following a familiar path. After about 50 feet, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and Margaret stopped in astonishment. The room was perhaps 20 feet across, with a vaulted ceiling that suggested skilled stonework. But it was the contents that made her heart race. Along one wall stood wooden crates, dozens of them, stacked with military precision. A desk occupied one corner, its surface covered with papers protected by oilcloth. Metal shelving held what appeared to be laboratory equipment, beakers, tubes, apparatus she couldn't identify. Scout had found a water dish and was drinking contentedly, suggesting this wasn't his first visit to this chamber. Margaret approached the desk first, carefully lifting the oilcloth. Beneath lay journals, their leather covers well preserved in the cool, dry environment. She opened one at random and found pages covered with meticulous handwriting and chemical formulas. The first entry was dated the 15th of October, 1923. "Today marks the beginning of my exile and my freedom. The university may have expelled me for my dangerous theories, but here, away from their narrow minds, I can pursue truth without interference. Robert has been more than generous in providing this sanctuary. I pray someday my work will vindicate us both." It was signed Professor Elias Hartwell. Margaret's breath caught. Hartwell, her maiden name. She'd known there was a family connection to this land, but the details had been lost to time and family shame. Her grandmother had spoken once, with embarrassment, of a relative who'd been cast out for improper thinking. She read on, piecing together a story that seemed lifted from fiction. Professor Elias Hartwell, a chemist at Columbia University, had been researching what he called biological acceleration compounds, substances that could enhance plant growth and crop yields far beyond natural limits. His colleagues had dismissed him as a fantasist. The university, under pressure from agricultural companies who saw his work as a threat to their fertilizer monopolies, had revoked his tenure on trumped-up charges of academic misconduct. Robert Hartwell, Walter's uncle, and Elias's cousin, had offered him sanctuary on this remote property. Together, they'd constructed this underground laboratory where Elias could continue his research away from corporate spies and academic politics. The journals documented 20 years of experiments, failures, and eventually, stunning successes. Elias had developed compounds that could triple crop yields, make plants resistant to drought and disease, and even restore fertility to depleted soil. But he'd kept his discoveries secret, paranoid about exploitation, and fearful of how his work might be perverted for profit rather than humanitarian purposes. The final entry, dated the 3rd of December 1943, was different. "War has taken Robert's sons, and age has taken my health. I am the last who knows of this place and its treasures. I have synthesized enough compounds to transform 1,000 acres of farmland, to feed multitudes, to change the world. But the world that expelled me, that sends its children to die in foreign lands perhaps does not deserve such gifts. I leave them here for Providence to decide their fate. May they find worthier hands than mine proved to be." Margaret set down the journal with trembling hands and turned to the crates. The first she opened contained glass vials, hundreds of them, each labeled with chemical notations. They were filled with various substances, powders, crystals, liquids in every color imaginable. Another crate held seeds, preserved in airtight containers. The labels read like a gardener's fantasy: drought resistant wheat #47, rapid growth tomatoes Hassan 2, perennial corn prototype Hashite. A third contained detailed growing instructions, soil preparation methods, and application rates for the various compounds. Everything was documented with scientific precision, including test results from decades of experiments. Scout's bark reminded her of Walter waiting anxiously above. She grabbed one of the journals and hurried back through the tunnel. "Maggie, thank God I was about to. What's that?" She helped him from his wheelchair to sit on the barn floor where he could see the journal. As she read aloud, his expression shifted from skepticism to amazement to something approaching awe. "This is incredible, but is it real? Could these compounds still be viable after 80 years? "Only one way to find out," Margaret said. They spent the next hours carefully exploring their underground treasure. Margaret brought up samples of various compounds and seeds, along with more journals and the detailed instructions. Walter, his analytical mind engaged despite his physical limitations, studied the formulas and notes. "This is graduate-level chemistry," he said. "Your ancestor was no charlatan. These formulas, they're based on sound science, just decades ahead of their time." As afternoon waned, they faced the practical question of what to do with their discovery. The ethical implications were staggering. If the compounds worked as described, they held the key to addressing world hunger, to revolutionizing agriculture, to making us very wealthy, Walter said quietly. Margaret met his eyes. "Is that what we want? To profit from this? We're living in a broken barn, Maggie. We've got $847 to our name. We're not in a position to be purely altruistic." It was true, but something in those journals, in Elias's story of betrayal and isolation, spoke to Margaret's heart. He'd been cast out for trying to help humanity, and he died believing the world didn't deserve his gifts. "We test it first," she decided. "Small scale. If it works, then we decide." Using a cleared patch behind the barn, they prepared a small garden plot. Following Elias's detailed instructions, Margaret applied minimal amounts of what the journal called growth catalyst #3 to the soil, then planted some tomato seeds they'd brought for their planned subsistence garden. The instructions said results would be visible within days. They seemed to be conservative. By the next morning, green shoots had already emerged. By the third day, the plants were a foot tall. By the end of the week, they had tomato plants that normally would have taken 2 months to achieve such size. "It's impossible," Walter breathed, touching the sturdy stems with wonder. But it wasn't impossible. It was Elias Hartwell's legacy, hidden for 8 decades, waiting for someone to discover it. Someone desperate enough to search where nobody else would look. Someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Scout watched them tend the miraculous plants, tail wagging, as if he'd known all along what lay beneath the barn. Perhaps he had. Perhaps some animals sense treasures that human eyes overlook. As Margaret helped Walter back into the barn that evening, she paused at the entrance to look back at their small experimental garden. In a week, they'd gone from homeless and hopeless to guardians of a secret that could change the world. The broken barn that was to be their final refuge had become a gateway to possibilities beyond imagination. But with those possibilities came responsibilities they were only beginning to comprehend. "What do we do now?" Walter asked. Margaret squeezed his shoulder. "We be careful. We be smart. And we remember why Elias hid this in the first place." The setting sun painted the derelict barn in shades of gold and crimson, transforming decay into beauty. Sometimes, Margaret thought, the greatest treasures are hidden in the most broken places, waiting for broken people to make them whole again. That night, as they lay on their makeshift bed with Scout between them, Margaret's mind raced with plans and possibilities. The immediate concern was improving their living situation. The barn needed basic repairs to be truly habitable, but they now had something to work toward beyond mere survival. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. A pickup truck navigated the rutted road, stopping near their barn. Margaret's heart raced. Had someone already discovered their secret? But the visitor was Dorothy Chen, the mail carrier who served the rural routes. She climbed out with a concerned expression and a box of supplies. "Mrs. Hartwell, I heard you folks were staying out here. Thought you might need some things." Dorothy's kindness was genuine, her worry evident. "This place, it's not fit for. I mean, are you sure you're okay?" "We're managing," Margaret said carefully. "Just need time to get back on our feet." Dorothy glanced at Walter in his wheelchair, at the dilapidated barn, clearly unconvinced. "My husband's good with construction. Maybe he could—" "We appreciate the offer," Walter interjected smoothly. "But we're actually enjoying the project. Gives us purpose, you know." After Dorothy left, promising to check on them again, they realized their isolation wouldn't last. Rural communities noticed everything. They needed to improve their visible circumstances quickly, or risk well-meaning intervention that might expose their discovery. Over the following weeks, they established a routine. Margaret tended their expanding garden, carefully documenting results. Everything Elias had claimed proved true, and then some. Vegetables grew with astonishing speed and size. Plants showed remarkable resistance to pests and weather extremes. Most incredibly, the soil itself seemed to improve rather than deplete with each planting. Walter, despite his limitations, proved invaluable in analyzing the journals and creating an inventory of their underground treasure. He estimated they had enough compounds to treat thousands of acres for decades. "The seeds are the real treasure," he noted. "These aren't hybrids that lose viability. They're enhanced versions that breed true. Plant the offspring, and they retain the improvements." They began selling produce at the farmer's market in the nearest town, careful to attribute their success to organic farming methods and heirloom varieties. The income, while modest, allowed them to buy materials for barn repairs and better equipment for Walter's mobility needs. Margaret hired local teenagers to help with the heavier work, paying generously and earning a reputation as that nice couple fixing up the old Hartwell place. The barn slowly transformed from eyesore to eccentric but solid dwelling. Scout appointed himself guardian of the tunnel entrance, spending hours lying near the concealed door. His vigilance proved necessary one afternoon when Margaret found him growling at fresh footprints near the eastern wall. "Someone's been snooping," she told Walter, examining the tracks. They improved their security, installing a better lock and carefully concealing the entrance under a false floor. The close call reminded them that secrets this valuable rarely stayed secret forever. 3 months after their arrival, as autumn painted the forest in brilliant colors, they received an unexpected call. Jennifer, their daughter, was coming to visit. "Mom, I've been worried sick. Patricia told me about the barn. I can't believe you're living there. I'm driving down tomorrow." Margaret's joy at seeing her daughter warred with anxiety about their secret. How could they explain their improved circumstances without revealing the truth? Jennifer arrived in a flurry of emotion and recrimination. "My God, Mom, this place—" She stopped, staring at the barn's exterior. While still obviously old, it now stood straight and weatherproof, with new windows and a freshly repaired roof. Inside, she found not the squalor she'd expected, but a rustic yet comfortable home. Walter's new electric wheelchair, purchased with their growing garden income, hummed as he showed her around. "I don't understand," Jennifer said. 3 months ago you had nothing. Now, we had each other," Walter said simply, "and we discovered we weren't as helpless as everyone thought." Margaret showed her the garden, carefully presenting it as the source of their turnaround. Jennifer, a city dweller with little agricultural knowledge, accepted the explanation of special farming techniques and perfect soil conditions. The visit rekindled family connections strained by distance and financial stress. Jennifer left promising more frequent contact and spreading word to Patricia that their parents had not only survived, but were somehow thriving. As winter approached, Margaret and Walter faced new challenges. The tunnel and underground chamber remained accessible, but they worried about temperature damage to the compounds. Following notes in Elias's journals, they confirmed the chamber maintained a constant temperature, protected by the Earth's insulation. They expanded their experiments, testing compounds designed for winter crops in a small greenhouse constructed from salvaged materials. The results continued to amaze vegetables growing in snow, thriving despite minimal sunlight. Word of their gardening success spread through the rural community. Other struggling farmers began approaching them for advice. Margaret shared general techniques, composting, crop rotation, natural pest control, while keeping the true secret carefully guarded. But success brought new dilemmas. How long could they maintain the pretense? How much good could they do while hiding the real source of their achievements? One evening, as they reviewed Elias's journals together, Walter voiced what Margaret had been thinking. We need to document everything ourselves. Create a record of what we've learned, how the compounds work in modern conditions, just in case. In case what? In case we don't live to see this through. We're not young, Maggie. This secret is too important to die with us. They began their own journals, recording everything in meticulous detail. Margaret documented the practical applications, while Walter analyzed the scientific principles. Together, they created a bridge between Elias's historical work and modern agricultural needs. Winter passed in a blur of activity. They supplied fresh vegetables to food banks, claiming successful greenhouse techniques. They helped neighbor farmers improve their yields through conventional methods enhanced by tiny amounts of diluted compound. They built networks of trust and reciprocity that embedded them firmly in the community that had initially viewed them with pity. Spring brought a registered letter that chilled their blood. The return address was a law firm representing Excelsior Agricultural Corporation. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, Walter read aloud, it has come to our attention that you may be in possession of proprietary agricultural technologies developed by the late Professor Elias Hartwell, whose work was funded in part by our predecessor company. We request a meeting to discuss proper ownership and licensing of any such materials. How could they know? Margaret whispered. Walter's expression was grim. Companies like Excelsior have been buying up agricultural patents for decades. They must have records from the 1,920 seconds. Maybe notice similarities between our results and old research. Or someone talked. The letter represented everything Elias had feared, corporate exploitation of discoveries meant to benefit humanity. They had 2 weeks before the requested meeting. We need help, Margaret decided. Legal help. They found it in an unexpected source. Patricia's college roommate had become an environmental lawyer, specializing in agricultural patents and corporate overreach. Sarah Martinez listened to their carefully edited story, leaving out the tunnel's location and extent of their discovery with growing excitement. If I understand correctly, you found documents and materials on your own property, left by a relative with no corporate employment contract at the time of creation? That's right, Walter confirmed. He was expelled from the university before developing these techniques. Then legally, you're in a strong position. Possession is 9/10 of the law, especially with an 80-year gap. But Excelsior has deep pockets. They'll try to bully you into compliance. Sarah helped them prepare for the meeting, coaching them on what to say and, more importantly, what not to say. She also suggested a backup plan that made Margaret's heart race. Document everything digitally. Create encrypted copies. If Excelsior tries to suppress this through legal action, be prepared to release it all publicly. Sometimes the threat of transparency is the best defense against corporate greed. The meeting took place in the nearest city, in a conference room that probably cost more to decorate than their entire barn renovation. 3 lawyers and 2 scientists represented Excelsior, their suits and attitudes projecting authority and entitlement. Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, the lead attorney Marcus Webb, began smoothly. We're here to offer you a generous compensation package for materials we believe rightfully belong to Excelsior's intellectual property portfolio. How generous? Walter asked, playing the role of interested farmer. The number they named would have seemed astronomical 3 months ago. Now, understanding the true value of Elias's legacy, it felt insultingly small. We'll need time to consider, Margaret said. Of course. But I should mention, If we're forced to pursue legal action, you could end up with nothing. And at your age, a protracted court battle. Webb let the threat hang. Sarah had warned them about this tactic, but she'd also prepared them with ammunition of their own. Mr. Webb, Walter said calmly, are you familiar with the Agricultural Innovation Protection Act of 2018? The lawyer's eyes narrowed slightly. Of course. Then you know that suppressing agricultural innovations that could benefit food security is now a federal crime. I wonder how Excelsior shareholders would react to headlines about the company trying to steal breakthrough farming techniques from elderly farmers who lost their home to medical bankruptcy. The room's atmosphere shifted. They'd shown they weren't naive victims, but informed opponents. After the lawyers left with promises to revisit their offer, Sarah was jubilant. You did perfectly. They're reassessing now, realizing you're not easy targets. But Margaret felt no victory. The secret was partially out now. Excelsior knew something valuable existed, even if they didn't know the full extent. We need to act faster, she told Walter that evening, before they find another angle. What happens next will transform not just their lives, but potentially the future of global agriculture, forcing them to choose between personal security and humanity's greater good. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. They spent the next weeks in intense preparation. Walter digitized all of Elias's journals, while Margaret carefully photographed each compound and created detailed databases of their experimental results. Sarah helped them establish a legal framework, a nonprofit foundation dedicated to agricultural innovation for food security. If we make this about profit, we're no better than Excelsior, Margaret argued. Elias hid this because he saw how greed corrupted good intentions. The Hartwell Agricultural Heritage Foundation was incorporated with a board including Sarah, Dorothy Chin, who'd proven trustworthy and passionate about community welfare, and Dr. James Okoye, a soil scientist from the State Agricultural Extension who'd been amazed by their techniques. Scout seemed to sense the urgency, following Margaret everywhere and spending long hours by the tunnel entrance, as if guarding against intrusion. His instincts proved prescient when he woke them one night with ferocious barking. Walter grabbed the flashlight while Margaret peered out the window. Two figures were near the barn's eastern wall, right where the tunnel entrance lay, hidden beneath their false floor. Call the sheriff, Walter whispered, but Margaret was already dialing. The intruders fled at Scout's continued barking, but they'd been photographed by the security camera Walter had installed. The images showed professional equipment, not random thieves, but corporate espionage. They're escalating, Sarah confirmed after reviewing the footage. We need to move faster. The Foundation's first public act was dramatic. They invited agricultural researchers from 3 universities to witness a demonstration. In a controlled greenhouse environment, they showed corn growing from seed to harvest ready in 6 weeks, tomatoes producing fruit 3 times normal size with enhanced nutritional content, and wheat thriving in soil deliberately contaminated with salt. The scientists' skepticism transformed into stunned excitement as they verified the results through their own instruments. Dr. Eloise Hancock from State University was the first to speak. This is revolutionary. The implications for global food security, for climate change adaptation. How is this possible? Margaret and Walter had prepared for this moment. They revealed portions of Elias's story, positioning him as a visionary ahead of his time, whose work they'd rediscovered and refined. The tunnel and full extent of their cache remained secret, but they shared enough to establish credibility. We're prepared to share this freely, Walter announced. Through the Foundation, for the benefit of all humanity. No patents, no exclusive licenses, no corporate control. The room erupted with questions, excitement, and no small amount of concern about Excelsior's likely response. They were right to worry. Within days, Excelsior filed lawsuits claiming theft of trade secrets, patent infringement, and fraud. They sought immediate injunctions to prevent any distribution of the compounds or seeds. But Margaret and Walter had anticipated this. On the same day the lawsuits were filed, The foundation released all of Elias's formulas and their own research onto the internet. Websites worldwide mirrored the data within hours. Agricultural forums exploded with discussion and experimentation plans. "You can't put the genie back in the bottle," Sarah told the furious Excelsior lawyers. "It's public domain now. Sue us into bankruptcy if you want. The knowledge is free." The legal battles would continue for years, but the war was effectively over. Small farmers worldwide began experimenting with the formulas. Universities launched research programs. Countries facing food insecurity demanded access. A year later, Margaret stood in their transformed barn, now a proper home with an attached greenhouse and laboratory. The Hartwell Foundation operated from a renovated building in town, distributing seeds and knowledge to anyone who asked. Walter, his health stabilized by reduced stress and purpose-driven days, worked with researchers to refine and improve Elias's formulas. At 77, he'd become an unlikely scientific celebrity, his practical farmer's wisdom balancing academic theory. Scout, now 13 and moving slowly but still alert, supervised all activities with patriarchal dignity. He'd trained Dorothy's young border collie to guard the tunnel, though its secret location was now known only to Margaret, Walter, and Sarah. Jennifer visited monthly, bringing her children to learn gardening from grandparents who'd become folk heroes in sustainable agriculture circles. Patricia had moved back from New York, managing the foundation's communications and fighting off corporate attempts to co-opt or corrupt their mission. "You gave away a fortune," Jennifer said one evening, watching the sunset from their porch. "You could have been billionaires." Margaret smiled, her hand entwined with Walter's. "We have everything we need. A home, purpose, family, community. What's that worth? But the stress, the lawsuits, the corporate attacks are nothing compared to living in a broken barn with $847 to our name," Walter said. "Besides, Elias didn't create this for profit. He created it to feed the hungry, to restore damaged land, to give humanity a chance. We're just honoring his vision." The impact was already visible. News reports showed transformed farms in Africa, improved yields in drought-stricken regions, and desert lands blooming with specially adapted crops. Not every experiment succeeded, but enough did to spark genuine hope. Excelsior eventually dropped their lawsuits, their legal position untenable and public relations disaster complete. Other corporations tried to patent variations of the formulas, but the foundation's legal team, now expanded with pro bono support from international law firms, fought each attempt. "The gift economy," Dr. Okoye called it. "You gave freely, and the world is giving back." One autumn evening, as they sat by the fire with Scout dozing at their feet, Walter asked, "Any regrets?" Margaret considered. They'd gone from comfortable farmers to homeless seniors to accidental revolutionaries. They'd faced corporate giants and won through simple transparency. They'd transformed a broken barn into both a home and a birthplace for agricultural transformation. "Just one," she said. "What's that? I wish we'd found that tunnel sooner. Imagine if we'd had 60 years instead of 6 to develop this." Walter chuckled. "Maybe it happened exactly when it should have, when we had nothing left to lose and everything to give." Scout raised his head and woofed softly, as if agreeing. Through the window, their greenhouse glowed with the green of thriving plants, Elias's legacy made manifest through their stewardship. The broken barn still stood, reinforced and cherished now, a monument to resilience and the treasures that await in the most unexpected places. The tunnel beneath remained, holding empty crates and fulfilled promises. Margaret pulled a worn journal from the shelf, not Elias's, but her own, documenting their journey from despair to purpose. She opened it to a blank page and began writing, "Year 2 at the barn. The foundation distributed 50,000 seed packets this month. Researchers report yield improvements averaging 300% with 60% less water usage. Corporate attempts to synthesize proprietary versions have failed. Something in Elias's formulas resists commercialization, as if he built in protection against greed. Walter's health continues stable. Scout still guards our secrets, though most are now freely shared. We've proven that abundance need not breed hoarding, that the poorest can become the greatest benefactors if given the chance." Tomorrow, delegates from the UN's Food Security Council visit to discuss global implementation. From a broken barn to the world stage, not the retirement we planned, but the purpose we needed. She closed the journal and rejoined Walter by the fire. Outside, the first snow of winter began falling, each flake catching light from their windows like tiny promises of springs to come. In the tunnel below, empty vials and fulfilled dreams bore witness to a truth Elias Hartwell had hidden for 8 decades. The greatest treasures aren't gold or silver, but the seeds of transformation, waiting in darkness for desperate hands to bring them into light. Margaret thought of their grandchildren, who would inherit a world where hunger might become history, where depleted soils could be restored, where small farmers could compete with corporate giants through knowledge freely shared. "Worth it," she murmured. "Every moment," Walter agreed. Scout's tail thumped against the floor, the rhythm of contentment and completion. They'd lost a farm and found a future. They'd entered a broken barn with nothing and discovered they held the keys to abundance. Sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another, larger tale. In a broken barn 60 miles from nowhere, 2 elderly outcasts and an aging dog had proven that the smallest seeds, planted with love and watered with purpose, can grow to feed the world. As they prepared for bed that night, Margaret paused at the window. Their original farmland, visible in the distance, was being developed as they'd feared, but surrounding it, as far as the eye could see, farms using their freely shared techniques showed green, even in winter's grip. "They took our land," she said softly. "And we gave them the earth," Walter replied. The broken barn creaked gently in the wind, no longer a symbol of loss, but a testament to the truth that from the deepest breakings can come the most profound healings, and in the darkest corners wait the brightest lights. 5 years had passed since that desperate flight to a derelict barn. 5 years that transformed not just their lives, but agricultural practices worldwide. The Hartwell Agricultural Heritage Foundation operated from multiple locations now, though Margaret and Walter remained at the barn, their unofficial headquarters and spiritual home. The tunnel had been expanded under professional supervision, becoming a climate-controlled storage facility for the most sensitive compounds and a museum of sorts, displaying Elias's original laboratory as he'd left it. Scientists came from around the globe to study there, seeking to understand not just what he'd created, but how he'd achieved insights decades ahead of conventional science. Walter, now 81, had published 3 books on practical applications of enhanced agriculture. His wheelchair had been replaced with an advanced mobility device, partly funded by grateful farmers whose lives the foundation had transformed. He could navigate the tunnel independently now, often found there teaching young researchers about the patient observation that farming requires. Margaret, at 79, had become the foundation's conscience and storyteller, ensuring that Elias's vision of freely shared abundance remained uncorrupted. She'd witnessed attempts to commercialize, to patent variations, to create scarcity from abundance. Each time, she'd fought back with transparency and generosity, flooding the market with free alternatives to any corporate attempt at control. Scout had passed peacefully 2 summers ago, aged 15. His last days spent lying in the sun near the tunnel entrance he'd guarded so faithfully. They'd buried him there, and within weeks, a volunteer sunflower had sprouted from his grave, growing with unusual vigor, as if the old dog's spirit insisted on one final contribution to the growing legacy. His protege, a young border collie named Hope, had taken over guardian duties with the same uncanny ability to sense threats to the tunnel's remaining secrets. For while most of Elias's work was now public, Margaret and Walter had kept one chamber sealed, its contents known only to them and Sarah. The nuclear option, Walter called it, compounds so powerful they could render entire ecosystems unstable if misused. Elias's final journals had warned against their release, unless humanity proved ready for such responsibility. That morning, Margaret woke to find Walter already in his mobility chair, staring out at their thriving demonstration garden. The autumn harvest was beginning, and volunteers would soon arrive to help distribute the bounty to food banks and shelters. "Thinking about Elias again?" she asked, knowing his contemplative moods. "Thinking about legacy?" he corrected. "He died believing his work was wasted. Never knew that it just needed the right moment, the right guardians. A knock interrupted their reflection. Dr. Chen, Dorothy's daughter, who'd followed her mother into public service, stood at their door with an expression mixing excitement and concern. "Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Hartwell, we have a situation. The UN delegation is here, but so is a team from Excelsior. They're claiming they've synthesized something that supersedes your compound." Margaret and Walter exchanged glances. Excelsior had been quiet for 2 years, licking their wounds after repeated legal defeats. This resurrection suggested new strategies. In the Foundation's conference room, built where the barn's collapsed section once stood, they found familiar antagonists with new faces. Marcus Webb had been replaced by a younger, sharper lawyer named Amanda Pierce. Beside her sat scientists in expensive suits, radiating confidence. The UN delegation, led by Dr. Amara Kouassi from Côte d'Ivoire, watched with careful neutrality as Pierce made her presentation. "Excelsior has invested millions in improving upon the Hartwell formulas," she began smoothly. "We've created compounds that increase yields by 500%, not just 300%. More importantly, we've made them shelf-stable for decades, not just years." She produced a sealed vial of iridescent powder. "This single container could transform 1,000 acres, and we're prepared to distribute it globally through proper channels, with appropriate quality control and pricing structures." "Pricing structures," Margaret repeated. "There it is. You want to sell what we give freely. We want to ensure responsible distribution," Pierce countered. "Your open-source approach has led to mutations, failures, ecological damage when amateurs experiment without supervision." It was a clever argument, appealing to legitimate concerns. Some had indeed misused the formulas, creating agricultural imbalances that took years to correct. But Margaret recognized the deeper game. "Show us your data," Walter demanded. "Independent verification of your claims." Pierce smiled. "Proprietary information, but we're prepared to demonstrate results under controlled conditions." The demonstration took place in Excelsior's mobile laboratory, a gleaming trailer that made their barn facilities look primitive. The corporate seeds, treated with their new compound, showed extraordinary growth within hours. But Hope, who'd accompanied them, reacted strangely. The normally calm dog whined and pawed at the ground where the demonstration plants grew, her distress escalating until Margaret had to remove her from the trailer. "Interesting," Walter murmured. "Our compounds never disturbed animals. Yours seem to." Dr. Kouassi, who'd remained silent, finally spoke. "We'll need long-term studies before the UN could endorse any new agricultural technology. The Hartwell compounds have 5 years of global data showing both benefits and manageable risks. You're asking us to trust corporate promises over proven community science." Pierce's smile tightened. "We're offering efficiency, scale, and yes, profit. Someone should benefit from feeding the world." "Someone does," Margaret said quietly. "Everyone." The meeting ended in stalemate, but Margaret noticed Walter collecting soil samples from where Excelsior's plants had grown. That evening, in their private laboratory, he analyzed them with growing alarm. "They've created something all right," he told Margaret. "But it's not an improvement. It's a dependency formula. Plants grown with this will require continuous treatment. Stop applying it, and they'll die within a season." "Engineered scarcity," Margaret breathed. "Subscription-based farming. Worse, the compound alters soil chemistry. Once used, the land won't support normal plants for years. They're trying to force adoption by making alternatives impossible." They called an emergency board meeting. Sarah, despite her years fighting corporate overreach, was shocked by the audacity. Dorothy Chen suggested immediate public exposure, while Dr. Okoye advocated for careful scientific verification first. "We need proof they can't dismiss as competitor bias," he argued. "Give me 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks stretched like months. Excelsior began aggressive marketing to developing nations, offering free initial treatments to demonstrate their compound's power. Several countries, desperate for improved yields, agreed to trials. But Hope's instincts proved prescient. Reports trickled in of livestock refusing to eat crops grown with Excelsior's compound, of beneficial insects dying in treated fields, of water sources showing chemical contamination. They've weaponized agriculture, Walter said, reading the latest reports. This isn't about profit anymore. It's about control. The foundation released their findings simultaneously across multiple platforms. Dr. Okoya's team had confirmed the dependency mechanism, the ecological damage, and most damningly, evidence that Excelsior knew about these effects from their own suppressed research. Public outrage was swift, but Excelsior had anticipated this. They pivoted to claiming their compound was meant for emergency use only in famine conditions, that the foundation was denying desperate populations a vital tool because of ideological purity. They're good, Sarah admitted, turning our ethics against us. That night, Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. She descended to the sealed chamber in the tunnel, Walter accompanying her despite her protests. Inside lay Elias's final legacy compounds he deemed too dangerous for release. One in particular had haunted Margaret since first reading about it, a soil restoration formula that could neutralize almost any contamination, break down synthetic dependencies, and return land to pristine condition within months. The antidote, Elias had called it, though he'd feared its use because it worked by accelerating biological processes to near-dangerous speeds. Misused, it could create runaway growth scenarios. We swore we'd keep this locked away, Walter reminded her. We swore we'd protect Elias's vision of agricultural freedom, Margaret countered. If we don't act, Excelsior will create a world where that freedom dies. They spent 3 days modifying the formula, adding safeguards Elias couldn't have imagined. With 1,940 seconds knowledge, modern molecular biology allowed them to create controlled versions that would neutralize Excelsior's compound without the broader risks. When they announced the antidote's existence, Excelsior's stock price plummeted. Countries that had agreed to trials demanded the neutralizing agent. Pierce arrived at their door within hours, flanked by a team of lawyers. "You're destroying legitimate commercial enterprise," she accused. "We'll sue for industrial sabotage." "Sue away," Margaret replied calmly. "We're giving away something that fixes the damage your product causes. Hard to make that illegal." Pierce's composure finally cracked. "Why can't you just let us profit? There's enough hunger for everyone to benefit. You could be billionaires, we could be billionaires. Everyone wins. Everyone loses," Walter corrected. "When food becomes a weapon, when abundance becomes artificial scarcity, when the earth itself is held hostage, everyone loses." The legal battles that followed were fierce but brief. Public opinion had turned decisively against Excelsior, especially after whistleblowers revealed internal documents showing the dependency mechanism was intentional, designed to create recurring revenue streams from agricultural necessities. The foundation's distribution of the antidote saved thousands of acres from long-term contamination. Farmers who'd been tricked into using Excelsior's compound wept with relief as their lands recovered. The UN formally endorsed the Hartwell Foundation's approach as the global standard for agricultural innovation. But victory came with reflection. That night, sitting in their reinforced barn as snow began falling, Margaret and Walter considered what they'd learned. "Elias was right to hide this for so long," Walter said. "Humanity wasn't ready in 1943. I'm not sure we're ready now. But we're learning," Margaret countered. "Each challenge teaches us. Each attempt to corrupt abundance shows more people why it must be protected." A knock at the door interrupted them. Jennifer stood there with her teenage daughter Emma, who'd been studying agricultural science inspired by her grandparents' work. "Emma has something to show you," Jennifer said, pride evident in her voice. The girl produced a small potted plant wheat, but unlike any variety they knew. "I've been experimenting with the public formulas," she explained shyly. "This strain can grow in 50% seawater. Imagine coastal areas, flood zones, places where fresh water is scarce." Margaret and Walter exchanged amazed glances. The next generation was taking Elias's foundation and building higher, seeing possibilities they'd missed. "I want to study with you," Emma continued. "Learn not just the science but the ethics, how to keep it free, how to resist corruption, how to ensure abundance remains abundant." "The tunnel?" Walter asked Margaret quietly. She nodded. It was time. They led Emma and Jennifer to the concealed entrance, Hope padding alongside with calm acceptance of new initiates. In the expanded museum section, Emma gasped at Elias's original laboratory, at the walls of preserved journals, at the evidence of one man's vision persevering through decades of darkness. "This is where it all began," Margaret said. "One rejected professor, hiding from corporate greed and academic blindness, working alone to feed the world. He died thinking he'd failed. But he didn't," Emma breathed. "He just planted seeds that needed time to grow." "Seeds and guardians," Walter added. "That's the real lesson. Knowledge isn't enough. It needs protectors, people willing to stand against those who would hoard or corrupt it." As they returned to the barn's warmth, Emma peppered them with questions about formulas, techniques, and the history of various discoveries. But her final question was the most perceptive. "How do you know when to release new knowledge? You kept some things secret for years, released others immediately. How do you decide?" Margaret smiled. "We ask ourselves what Elias would do. He wasn't perfect, his isolation limited his impact, but his core principle guides us. Does this action increase abundance for all, or create advantage for few?" The answer usually becomes clear. Later, as Jennifer and Emma prepared to leave, the teenager paused at the door. "Grandma, Grandpa, what you've done! It's like you took the worst moment of your lives and transformed it into the world's gain." After they left, Margaret and Walter sat quietly, processing the truth in their granddaughter's words. From foreclosure to revolution, from a broken barn to a broken corporate monopoly, they'd traveled an impossible road. "Do you think Elias would approve?" Walter asked. "Of how we've used his gift?" Scout's old collar hung by the door, a reminder of the faithful friend who'd led them to their destiny. Beside it, Hope snoozed peacefully, continuing the watch. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "he'd be amazed that two broke, elderly farmers and one intuitive dog could finish what he started. That abundance won over scarcity, that generosity defeated greed, that a broken barn could shelter world-changing truth." The antidote distribution continued globally, healing lands damaged by corporate overreach. The foundation expanded, training new generations in both agricultural science and the ethics of abundance. Excelsior, its reputation destroyed and leadership facing criminal charges, dissolved into bankruptcy, a warning to others who might try similar schemes. But in the barn where it all began, life continued with simple rhythms. Morning coffee, afternoon garden work, evening documentation of new discoveries. They were no longer the desperate elderly couple who'd arrived with $847 and nowhere else to go. They were guardians of abundance, protectors of Elias's vision, proof that the smallest seeds of justice, planted in the poorest soil, can grow to feed nations. As Margaret made her final journal entry that night, she thought about the tunnel below, still holding secrets for future moments of need. About Emma and others like her who would carry the mission forward. About the broken barn that had become a birthplace of hope. "Year 6 in the barn," she wrote. "From nothing, everything. From brokenness, wholeness. Elias Hartwell's ghost can rest now. His work is complete. His vision protected. His gift given as he always intended freely, to all who hunger, for all time." She closed the journal and joined Walter by the fire. Outside, snow fell on fields that would bloom impossibly in spring, on a world where hunger was retreating before the advance of shared knowledge, on a broken barn that had sheltered the greatest treasure of all, the proven truth that abundance shared is abundance multiplied, and that even the poorest among us can become benefactors of all humanity. "Worth it," she murmured, echoing words from years before. "Every broken board," Walter agreed. "Every cold night, every legal battle, every corporate threat. Worth it all." Hope raised her head and woofed softly, and in that sound they heard Scout's approval, Elias's vindication, and the promise of springs eternal. The broken barn stood strong against winter's wind, no longer a last resort, but a first foundation for the world they'd helped to birth. Sometimes the greatest fortunes can't be counted in dollars, but in lives fed, lands healed, and futures secure. In a tunnel beneath a broken barn, An elderly couple found not just Elias Hartwell's compounds, but a truth more valuable than any treasure: that generosity is the only wealth that multiplies when divided, and that the poorest hands, empty of all but purpose, can hold gifts enough to change the world. The fire crackled peacefully as night deepened around their unlikely home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts to corrupt or control what they'd freed. But tonight, they rested in the certainty that abundance, once released, can never again be completely contained. And in fields around the world, seeds planted with their gift grew strong and free, proof that sometimes the end of one story, a farm foreclosed, a couple displaced, is just the beginning of another, greater tale. A tale of how two people with nothing left to lose found everything worth saving, hidden in the last place anyone would look, beneath a broken barn, guarded by a faithful dog, waiting through decades for hearts brave enough to share its plenty with a hungry world. Margaret reached for Walter's hand as the fire dimmed toward embers. "No regrets?" she asked, their traditional evening question. "Only gratitude," he replied. "For the journey, the purpose, the chance to matter when we thought we were done mattering. For Scout finding that door," she added. "For Elias leaving it unlocked," he continued. "For each other," they said together. Hope curled closer to the dying fire, and in her peaceful breathing they heard the rhythm of work completed, duty fulfilled, abundance assured. The broken barn creaked its lullaby around them, and they slept the sleep of those who've transformed their greatest loss into humanity's lasting gain. 10 years had passed since they first stood at the barn's threshold, evicted and afraid. Now, delegations from around the world made pilgrimages to what had become the spiritual center of the agricultural abundance movement. The barn, rebuilt and reinforced, but maintaining its essential character, housed a stream of visitors seeking not just knowledge, but wisdom. Margaret, at 84, still rose before dawn to tend the demonstration gardens. Her movements were slower, but her mind remained sharp, cataloging results, noting variations, teaching anyone willing to learn. The plants seemed to recognize her touch, growing with particular vigor under her care. Walter, 86, had become something of a legend in agricultural science circles. His practical applications of Elias's theories had revolutionized farming on 6 continents. Universities competed to have him speak, though he preferred intimate sessions in the barn, teaching small groups the patient observation that corporate agriculture had forgotten. Hope, now a mature dog, had trained her own successor, a keen-eyed shepherd named Promise, who showed the same uncanny ability to sense threats to the tunnel's remaining secrets. For while most of Elias's work had transformed global agriculture, that final chamber remained sealed, its contents too powerful for a world still learning to handle abundance responsibly. That morning brought unexpected visitors. A convoy of official vehicles wound up the improved but still rural road, bearing representatives from the World Food Program, the Gates Foundation, and surprisingly, Amanda Pierce, former Excelsior lawyer turned advocate for agricultural reform after witnessing the destruction her former employer had attempted. Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Hartwell, Dr. Kouassi greeted them warmly. He'd aged too, but his eyes still sparkled with the passion that had made him a powerful ally. "We come with a proposal." They gathered in the barn's main room, now a comfortable meeting space where critical decisions affecting global food security were regularly made. The proposal was sweeping: a 10-year initiative to eliminate hunger entirely, funded by a coalition of governments and reformed corporations who'd learned that shared abundance created more stable markets than artificial scarcity. "We need the foundation to lead this," Amanda Pierce said, her transformation still startling to witness. "You've proven that ethics and efficiency can coexist. That generosity creates rather than depletes wealth." Margaret and Walter listened as the delegation outlined plans: seed banks in every nation, training programs for sustainable farming, protection of agricultural knowledge as a human right rather than corporate property. "And the sealed chamber?" Walter asked quietly. "What of Elias's final formulas?" Dr. Kouassi leaned forward. "We believe it's time, not for general release, but for carefully controlled use in crisis zones, places where conventional restoration would take decades." Margaret and Walter exchanged glances. A lifetime of shared decision-making in that look. We'll need safeguards, Margaret said. Oversight that can't be corrupted by changing governments or corporate influence. An international council, Amanda suggested. Farmers, scientists, ethicists, rotating membership, transparent operations, all decisions public. They spent hours refining the proposal. As afternoon sun slanted through the barn's windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like possibilities, agreement was reached. That evening, they led the delegation to the tunnel. Even those who'd heard descriptions gasped at the reality. The precisely carved passages, the preservation of Elias's laboratory, the weight of history in those underground chambers. At the sealed door, Margaret and Walter performed the opening ritual they'd created, not for security, but for solemnity, reminding all present that they were handling power that could heal or harm on a global scale. Inside, Elias's final legacy waited. Compounds that could restore Chernobyl's soil, reclaim the Sahara's edges, neutralize decades of industrial poisoning, but also formulas that, misused, could create ecological chaos. With great power, Walter murmured, and everyone present understood. They removed only what was needed for the immediate crisis zones, documenting everything, creating redundant oversight systems. The chamber was resealed with new protections, its contents now under international guard, rather than hidden by two elderly farmers and a perceptive dog. As the delegation departed, Amanda lingered. "I need to apologize again," she said, "for what Excelsior tried to do, for my part in it." "You've more than redeemed yourself," Margaret assured her. "Your legal expertise has protected countless farmers from exploitation. It doesn't feel like enough, not compared to what you've given the world." Walter spoke gently. "We didn't give the world anything. Elias did. We just made sure his gift reached its intended recipients. But at such personal cost. Living here in isolation, fighting corporate attacks, risking everything, gaining everything," Margaret corrected. "Purpose, community, the knowledge that we mattered. That's not cost, that's reward." After Amanda left, they sat on the barn's porch, watching sunset paint the mountains. The demonstration gardens spread before them, a patchwork of abundance that drew agricultural students and seasoned farmers alike. 10 years, Walter mused. "Did you imagine this when we first saw the barn?" Margaret laughed. "I imagined freezing to death that first winter, or starving, or being dragged back to face Excelsior's lawyers empty-handed. Instead, we changed the world. Elias changed the world. Scout found the door. We just turned the handle. Hope patted over, followed by promise, and both dogs settled at their feet. The guardian tradition continued, as did the work. Their daughter Jennifer emerged from the barn's guest quarters. She'd moved back permanently, managing the foundation's daily operations and caring for her parents with the same dedication they'd shown to Elias's legacy. "Emma called," she reported. "Her team successfully restored those mercury-contaminated fields in Peru using the modified formula. The local farmers are calling it a miracle." "It's science," Walter corrected automatically. "Miraculous science, but reproducible and shareable." She also said to tell you she's pregnant. She wants to name the baby Elias if it's a boy, Margaret if it's a girl. Margaret's eyes misted. The next generation, not just continuing the work, but honoring its roots. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret descended to the tunnel alone. She often did this, drawn by the need to connect with Elias's spirit, to reassure herself that they'd remain true to his vision. In his preserved laboratory, she opened one of his journals at random. "I dream of a world where hunger is memory, where the earth's abundance is recognized and shared rather than hoarded and sold. They call me mad for believing science should serve humanity rather than profit. Perhaps madness is simply sanity in an insane system." "We did it, Elias," she whispered to the shadows. "Your dream is becoming reality." A sound made her turn. Walter had followed, moving carefully with his walker but determined. "Couldn't sleep either?" "I was thinking about our grandchildren," he said. "And their children. What world we're leaving them. A better one than we inherited. Not perfect, but better. Abundant rather than scarce. Generous rather than grasping." They stood together in the chamber where it all began, two people in their 80s who'd found their life's purpose in their 70s. The tunnel around them held echoes of desperate discovery, patient experimentation, and world-changing revelation. "I've been thinking about afterwards," Walter said quietly. "Who continues this when we're gone? Jennifer, Emma, the thousands we've trained. The knowledge is free now, can't be contained or lost. But the wisdom? The understanding of why it must stay free?" Margaret considered. "That's why we tell the story, over and over. The evicted elderly couple, the broken barn, the faithful dog, the hidden tunnel. Not as myth, but as reminder, abundance found in desperation must be shared in prosperity." They made their way back to the barn, Promise alertly escorting them while Hope supervised from the entrance. The night sky blazed with stars, each point of light a sun warming worlds they'd never see but had helped to feed. Inside, Jennifer had left tea warming for them, anticipating their restlessness. Such small kindnesses, multiplied across the global community they'd helped create, form the true structure of the new abundance. The Universal Basic Food Initiative launches next month, Jennifer reported over breakfast. Every human guaranteed access to Hartwell seeds and basic growing knowledge. The UN votes Tuesday, but passage is certain. Margaret and Walter smiled at each other. Elias's compounds had made plants grow, but the real growth had been in human understanding that food security was a right, not a commodity. Excelsior's former headquarters is being converted to a training center, Jennifer continued. They want to call it the Hartwell Institute. The Elias Hartwell Institute, Walter corrected. Credit where it's due. The day unfolded with typical busy purpose. Visitors arrived for tours. Researchers consulted on new applications. Farmers sought advice on specific challenges. Margaret and Walter moved through it all with practiced grace, teaching, guiding, inspiring. But that evening, as they again sat watching sunset from their porch, a different weariness settled over them. Not the exhaustion of overwork, but the deeper fatigue of a long race well run. "We've done what we came here to do," Walter said softly. Margaret nodded. "Elias's work is safe, shared, protected. The next generation is trained and committed. The world will never again accept hunger as inevitable. So what now? Now we rest, truly rest, knowing we answered the call when it came." They held hands as darkness gathered. Two people who'd lost a farm and found a purpose, who'd entered a broken barn with nothing and discovered they had everything needed to change the world. In the tunnel below, Promise kept watch over secrets now shared with humanity. The broken barn stood strong against another winter, no longer desperate shelter, but shrine to the power of generosity over greed. And across the globe, seeds planted with knowledge freely given grew toward harvest. Proof that the greatest treasures are often hidden in the most broken places, waiting for broken people to make them whole and share them with a hungry world. The story that began with an eviction notice trembling in an elderly woman's hands had become legend. But more importantly, it had become blueprint. When corporate power seemed overwhelming, when age seemed to equal uselessness, when loss seemed total, remember the Hartwells. Remember that beneath the most unlikely surface might lie the answer to humanity's need. Margaret and Walter Hartwell had given the world more than agricultural abundance. They'd proven that generosity multiplies, that knowledge shared is power distributed, that two elderly people with nothing but determination could stand against corporate greed and win. As they prepared for bed that night, their movements slow but satisfied, Walter asked one more time, "Any regrets?" Margaret smiled. "Only that we can't see how far this will grow, how many will be fed, how much land restored, how many corporate monopolies broken by farmers with free seeds and shared knowledge." "Maybe that's gift enough," Walter suggested. "To plant seeds whose full harvest we'll never see. Isn't that what Elias did?" They slept peacefully in their renovated barn, surrounded by the gardens they'd tended and the community they'd built. In the tunnel, Promise dozed lightly, carrying forward the guardian tradition. Above ground, their legacy grew with each planted seed, each shared formula, each farmer choosing abundance over scarcity. The broken barn had one final secret, not hidden compounds or forgotten formulas, but the simple truth that from the deepest losses can come the greatest gifts if we have courage to descend into darkness and bring what we find back into the light. Margaret and Walter Hartwell had made that descent and that return, and the world would never be the same. As you've witnessed this incredible journey from desperation to triumph, remember that sometimes life's greatest treasures are hidden in the most unexpected places. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more amazing tales of human resilience and hidden miracles. Click on one of the 2 stories on your screen now to continue your journey into the extraordinary